Joey from One Way to Make here, and I've always wanted to try milling my own lumber, but it's always felt just far enough out of reach for someone who's not a full-time woodworker. Can a beginner woodworker mill their own lumber effectively, or should we leave it to the pros and just buy pre-milled lumber? We'll go over all the steps it takes, the tools you'll need, and how much it will cost to get started. So follow along and see if we can flatten out some boards, or if I've made a huge mistake by buying all this fancy crap. Wish me luck. We're starting with rough, unmilled lumber. Milling a side of a board is also known as surfacing it. So right now, we're surfaced on 0 sides, also known as S0S. And our goal is to take these boards all the way to S4S, surfaced on 4 sides. This is 5/4 white oak that we're cutting up right now. You can mill boards to any length that you want, but to make things a little easier on yourself, I recommend cutting your boards to the smallest size that you can for the project you're working on. You're not a lumber yard, so don't feel like you need to mill boards to a certain length or width. Cutting all your boards to 4, 6, or 8 foot lengths now is just going to cause more waste later. And although the idea of full stacks of lumber, all milled up and ready to go, sounds nice, for me, it's not really realistic. For my project, which will hopefully end up being a vanity, I need a stack of boards that are 26 inches long and a stack that are 30 inches long. But I'd like to leave myself plenty of room for error later in the project, so I'm cutting half of these boards to 30 inches and the other half to 34. The actual rough cutting of these boards is pretty straightforward. I'm using a miter saw, but a circular saw or jigsaw would also work great for this step. Now's also the time to decide what defects you're okay with in your finished piece. I'm okay with some small cracks and knots, making these boards what most would call character grade. But I do cut around some of the larger knots that I know I don't want in my final piece. Once I have enough boards for my projects and they're cut roughly to length, I can move on to getting my first side surfaced, and for that, I'll be using a jointer. I'm using this little benchtop joiner made by Craftsman, and regardless of what joiner you choose, they all have the same basic function: to remove a small amount of wood from the high sections of your board, leaving a flat edge. I check that the fence is square to my infeed table. I like to use a speed square to do this, and mine needs a little bit of adjustment. Once I'm all squared up, I set the height of my outfeed table and my blade. The amount the blade sets above the infeed table determines how much wood you'll remove with each pass. I'm setting mine at a conservative 1/32 of an inch. There's 2 types of cuts I'll be making on the joiner: an edge joint and a face joint, and you should always face joint first. However, I like to do a really light edge joint first, just so that I have a somewhat straight edge to slide against my fence when I'm ready to face joint. For this initial edge joint, I set my board edge down on the infeed table and slowly push it through the blade and onto the outfeed table. I just take 1 or 2 passes here. Next, I flip the board 90 degrees onto its face with the edge I just jointed facing the fence. Then, using some push blocks, I repeat the same process of pushing the board over the blades and onto the outfeed section of the jointer. For me, on a relatively inexpensive benchtop jointer like these, edge jointing goes pretty smooth, but face jointing can be a real challenge. The first challenge I run into is snipe. Snipe happens on a joiner when the beginning or end of a board doesn't stay totally parallel with the in or out feed table. This becomes more of an issue the smaller the in and out feed tables are of your jointer. And on these benchtop joiners, they're usually pretty small. The best way to minimize snipe is to make sure you have consistent down pressure on your boards at all times. And I like to use push blocks whenever jointing to keep my hands as far away from the blades as possible. Another common issue I struggle with are these peaks and valleys that sometimes cover the whole board and other times don't show up at all. After some trial and error, I found these were caused by excess vibration. This jointer is light, which makes it really easy to move around, but it also allows it to vibrate. And when it does, the board rises and falls slightly, and when that happens over and over again, it causes these imperfections. Luckily, this jointer and most like it come with these handy screw holes so you can attach it directly to your workbench, and when I did that, the vibration and imperfections were much less noticeable. And as a bonus, it stopped the joiner from sliding around, making it much easier and safer to use. Once your board is face jointed, it's time to properly edge join it. To do this, flip the board 90 degrees so that the newly flat face rests against the fence. This step is pretty easy. Just make sure that the face of your board stay tight to your fence at all times. Instead of face jointing all your boards and then edge jointing them all, it's much easier to face and edge joint each board at the same time. Assuming your fence is square to your joiner's infeed table, at the end of this step, you should have boards that are S2S and 90 degrees from each other. Now all you have to do is repeat this process for every single board. And for me, this process was actually pretty enjoyable. Especially with some music or an audiobook, the time flies by. But it can become a little tedious, and it's easy to become complacent with repetitive tasks like this, and that's when accidents happen. So make sure you stay alert and focused. Jointing's one of the first steps in the milling process, but I'd argue that it's the most important of any step. And if you mess up on this step, there's not much you can do to save your board. The biggest risk here is that in trying to make your board perfectly flat, you end up removing too much thickness. You may not even notice you're too thin until you start planing, and then it's too late. Here's a few ways you can avoid that. First is just to do a good job. Ask any experienced miller with nice tools how much they worry about this, and it won't be much at all. And as you get more experience with milling and start to upgrade to better tools, you'll get the hang of this process and have very little waste. So if you do mess this up, don't get discouraged. It's wood, it literally grows on trees. Grab a new piece and give it another shot. But until you get to that point, there's still a few things we can do to set yourself up for success. When you're picking out your lumber, make sure to bring a tape measurer with you. You'll need it anyways to figure out your board feet, and then really inspect your boards when picking them out. If you're in the 4/4 section, the board should be an inch thick, but they'll still vary in thickness a bit. Go with the widest ones you can, and also the more twist, bow, or curve that a board has, the more material you'll have to remove to get it flat in the milling process. So go for the straight ones. This next tip may be a controversial one because it's pretty easy to argue that it's a huge waste of money and material. But for me, it's been worth it. I'm going for a finished board thickness of 3/4 of an inch, so I should be able to buy 4/4 lumber, mill it down, and get the right thickness. But instead, I opted to buy 5/4 lumber, which is 1 1/4 inches thick, which means I'm wasting an extra 25% of my board feet and the money I spent on it. And that's a lot. But it did ensure that I didn't throw away a single board because it was too thin after I finished milling. This isn't a habit I'll stay in forever, but it really saved me here, and if you're just starting out, it's something to consider. Oh, and one more tip on jointing. I picked up this push block, and it's made the whole face joining process way easier. It has these retractable feet, so it sits flat on the top of your board for the first part of your cut, but once you reach the end of your board, the feet pop out and let you push the board forward with just the right amount of down and forward pressure. I picked this one up on Amazon, and I'll throw a link for it in the description in case you're interested. Now onto the table saw and the third side of our boards. And this step is nice and straightforward, but you do need to make a decision here that will affect the rest of your project. You need to decide if you want all your boards to have the same width. If so, you can set your saw's fence to your desired width and run all your boards through. This option is easy and makes for a really clean finished piece, but it does create a lot of waste. The other option, and what you see me doing here, is to measure each board to see the total width that you can get out of it and set your saw's fence to just under that width. If you go with this route, pass your board through the saw, removing its rough edge, then grab another board, remeasure, reset your fence, and cut that board as well. The good answer for why I choose this method is that it gives the finished piece a little more character and visual interest. And that's all true, but the real answer is I just don't want to waste any more of my boards than I have to. Both options here are great, and it really just comes down to personal preference. I do have a few guidelines that I go by for the width of my boards. I usually don't use any boards under 2 inches wide. There's nothing wrong with them, but it's just as much work to mill a 2-inch board as it is to mill a 6-inch board, and for me, that's not worth the extra time and effort. On the other side, I don't like to use any boards over 8 inches wide. Anything larger than this will have a greater chance of warping over time. If you do have boards this large, Don't let them go to waste. Cut them down the middle and get 2 boards out of each of them. Just make sure that during your glue up, you don't glue them back together in the same orientation as you cut them. This will still cause the same issue with warping. Now on to our 4th and final side, and the most fun step of this entire process, the planer. Planers serve 2 major functions. First, as long as one side of the board is already flat like ours are here, the planer can flatten out the opposite side of that board. If your board isn't flat on the bottom, the planer will transfer these issues and neither side of your board will be flat. So before you move on to this stage, make sure you've taken your time on the jointer and you're starting with a nice flat face. I'm using a 13-inch DeWalt benchtop planer, and these are pretty common for beginners. I'm also using this melamine jig I made to help make this step easier. The jig definitely isn't necessary, but it's a whole lot cheaper to make than the planer is to buy, and it's worked really well for me. Treat yourself and make one of these to go with it. And if you do decide to make one, check out this video and see how we made ours. The second function of your planer is to make your boards any thickness you'd like and ensure that all your boards are the same thickness. To get started, I need to find my thickest board and use it to set the height of my planer. Right now, my boards range in thickness from around 7/8 of an inch to 1 1/8 inch. Unfortunately, I can't set my planer to 7/8 and run all my boards through on this first pass. Instead, I set my height to a little over an inch and run my thickest boards through, taking off no more than 1/16 of an inch or so. But don't forget, if you're using a jig like this, the measurements on the side of your planer won't be accurate, so don't forget to account for the thickness of your melamine. After this pass, I drop the planer's head another 1/16 of an inch. About a half turn of the handle seems to work pretty well for me. Each pass, you should be sending more and more boards through until you get to the point where even your thinnest board is touching the planer's blade with each pass. Once you're here, take a measurement of your board's thickness, and hopefully you're still over the finished thickness that you were hoping for. If not, sorry buddy, your table's not going to be as thick as you wanted it to be. But don't worry, I hear that thin tables are all the rage in Europe, or Asia, or North America, or really anywhere that you don't live. Luckily for me, my boards are currently about 15/16 of an inch thick, and I'm going for that finished panel thickness of 3/4 of an inch like we talked about earlier. This means my next step is to run all my boards through the planer again to get them all closer to my desired thickness. If these boards weren't being glued up into a panel, I'd take them all the way down to 3/4 of an inch in this step, and we could call it done. But these are going to be turned into panels, and I know I'm not going to get my glue up perfect. For that reason, I'm leaving my boards slightly thicker than 3/4 of an inch, and I'll bring them down to final size when they're all glued up. My boards are just about finished on the planer, and we can finally call them S4S. From this point, the possibilities are nearly endless, and that's a really great feeling. But before we wrap up, let's quickly take another look at the entire milling process and get a quick sneak peek of the next steps of this project. And while we do that, let's talk about the pluses and minuses of milling, as well as the costs associated with it, and see if buying all this equipment was really the right choice. First, we cut the boards into manageable sizes, and I'm figuring no costs here, because if you're considering milling lumber, you probably already have either a circular saw or a miter saw. Next, we joint our boards, and this jointer was a little underpowered for what we were trying to do here, but it did get the job done, and it cost me about $350. Next, we headed over to the table saw, and I'm also not figuring any extra cost here for the same reason as the circular saw. We are using them for milling here, but they have a lot of other uses, and they're found in almost every shop. The planer, however, is specific to milling, and is where we spent the most money, but it did do a really good job here. I got mine on sale, but the listing price for these is $700. So for a bare minimum, if you just need the jointer and the planer, that's $1,050, which is a big investment. To put it into some perspective, for the same price, you could either have a Festool Domino or a track saw, both of which are really high-end and sought-after tools. Or you could buy over 2,000 hot dogs and start your own hot dog empire. With great options like those, does spending this much money really make sense? For me, that question really has 2 parts. 1, will this save me money over time? And 2, Does milling my own lumber get me a better finished product? First, the cost. Pre-milled lumber is more expensive than rough-sawn lumber. The amount can vary, but at a lumber yard, $2 to $3 per board foot higher for milled lumber is pretty common. Lumber yards may also offer milling as a service, which typically runs $100 to $150 an hour. There are also some great online options for purchasing lumber, but the cost difference between unmilled lumber and milled lumber will be about the same as it would be from a lumber yard. And all the options I looked at, regardless of how I got these boards milled, it would have cost me around $150 more to buy them S4S than it did to get them rough sawn. Using those numbers, after about 7 projects of this size, I'll have my planer and joiner paid off with the savings from each project. That's not a terrible payoff, but for a beginner woodworker, it might take a long line to make 7 projects. And if you don't have as much time to build as you'd like, milling your own boards is a time-consuming process, and it may be worth the extra expense to be able to skip this step. But what about the quality? Does milling my own lumber make my projects even better? Well, as opposed to buying pre-milled lumber from a box store, yes, I think this is better. I have a much wider selection of wood species as well as lengths, widths, and thicknesses. But compared to a lumberyard, on this project I think I would have made out just as well if they milled the boards for me. This was a pretty simple milling process, and any lumberyard should be able to get you great results on boards like these. But sometimes, you're not going to want boards that are exactly 3/4 of an inch thick. You'll also never have as much control over the grain and defects in your piece as you would if you mill lumber yourself. So, what's the answer? Is the money and the time investment worth it? I don't know. I really don't. It's going to be different in everyone's case, but here's how I'm feeling right now. If you've never built something, or if your projects to this point have just been made out of plywood and you're ready to take that next step into hardwood and glue-ups, I say don't also take the step into milling at the same time. Grab some maple or oak board from Lowe's or Home Depot. They won't be extremely exciting, and you'll pay a little more for them, but they should be flat and easy to work with. If that goes well, find a local lumber yard or online dealer that offers milling as a service. Then work this way until you're feeling a little more comfortable. Then finally take that next big step into buying milling equipment. When you do decide to take that jump, buy the best versions of the planer and jointer that you can afford at the time. But don't stress if you can only afford the cheapest ones. They'll cause you some headaches, but in my experience, they still get the job done. And that's about all the advice I have. Even if you've never used the jointer or planer before, follow these steps, be safe, and you'll be amazed at the results you can get. It's expensive to get started and can be a real pain sometimes, but it's the best way I know to take your furniture to the next level. And don't be intimidated. If you can use a miter saw or a table saw, you can absolutely do everything shown in this video. So good luck, be safe, and make something awesome. Thanks so much for watching.